I would have really liked to be there, but we'll make the best of it, I guess. And so I guess I'll have about 60 to 70 minutes of presentations, and then after that, I'll open for questions. Can you hear me well first?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So today what I'll do is work around the idea of monetary sovereignty, basically looking at what it is, how it is implemented, and the implications of monetary sovereignty. And so in doing so, we'll look at how the central bank and the treasury basically routinely work together, and look at some general principles that we can derive from that. And so let's, where do I go next now? Next, here we go. So that's what we'll do today. So we'll first look at some common misconceptions and look at what is monetary sovereignty, how it is implemented, and some implications. So common misconceptions are several. The first one is that there is really a clear-cut difference between the central bank and national treasuries, and that they don't talk to each other. They are completely independent from each other. And so with that comes the idea that monetary policy is basically the strict domain of the central bank, and fiscal policy, the strict purview of the national treasury. And so they work independently to set each policy, and there is no coordination between them. We also have the idea that the central bank is completely independent from the national treasury and doesn't need to bother about what the treasury needs are, and just work on its own corner. We have the idea also that the fiscal position, so fiscal surplus, balanced budget, or fiscal deficit, all that is under control of the Treasury and Congress. And so a fiscal deficit is seen as an abnormal fiscal position, and it reflects basically the poor budgetary management skills of policymakers. Okay. And the last corollary point here is that the public debt is basically merely a budgetary tool that is used to finance the treasury. And so throughout the presentation, I'll try to revisit each point, either directly or indirectly, to try to show that this is really not the way things work in reality. So the first point is monetary sovereignty, what it is. And so the first thing is that you have a government that basically sets and enforces monetary laws, sets the unit of account, determines the means of payments, determines what a payment is, determines when a debtor is cleared of his creditors. So quite a few things here to determine. It issues in convertible national currency, and it has monopoly over that issuance. It also issues a public debt denominated in that currency. And it taxes in the national currency. And so that's basically what monetary sovereignty is all about. Now, some governments are closer than others to monetary sovereignty. Okay, so we'll revisit that by, for example, looking at developing countries that have issues taxing in their national currency. And so with that comes issues in terms of ability to obtain the resources that are needed. So to pursue further the definition, what we can see is that monetary sovereignty emerges progressively 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And the main goal, and with that, of course, emerged modern monetary systems. Okay, so modern money emerges at that time. And the goal here is to compel the population to move resources to the governing authorities, which at the time were basically priests. Okay, and if you want a good story of how we move from the tribal system to a system with priests that are compelling the population to give them resources, there is a good article by John Henry that looks at Egypt. And so have a look at John Henry in Egypt. It'll explain to you how that happened. Then what we find is that it's tax driven, where the word tax means compulsory payments that have to be made by the population, and involves establishing an asymmetric power relation where you have an imposition of dues to be paid in a national currency. So you have what we call a tax liability. So you have to pay in the future. You have become indebted to the government, and the government promises that the discharge of that debt can be done in the national currency whenever that is due. And then once you have imposed, of course, for that to be credible and people believe that they will have to pay the tax, you have to do some enforcement too. And so the debt has to be discharged by redeeming the national currency, taking it back. Okay, so that's what the tax payment is all about. And so there are negative consequences for those who do not pay their tax, okay, ranging from fine, prison, death, or others. Okay, so here what we have here is a story of money that is quite different from the barter story of money. Okay, the idea that money emerges from voluntary exchange between equally powerful entities. Okay, that decide they want to trade between each other. Okay, and unfortunately, Paul wants to buy pears, but John doesn't have pears, that has apples. So we have a problem. So let's figure out a way to improve trade by smoothing exchange through money. Okay. What we find in the historical record is really not how modern monetary system emerges. What we have more is force, deceits, and asymmetric power relations. What we have also is that a sovereign that can't and won't enforce dues will see its monetary sovereignty challenged. So you not only need to impose dues first so that you create an acceptance for your currency, but then you need to enforce the payment of the dues. And if you can't, well, that creates problem to move resources for the public purpose because people don't want your currency. And so here we have several issues that come in. So if you have an unstable political system, if you have poor enforcement mechanisms, or if it's difficult to track economic transactions, well, in that case, it's going to be much more difficult to enforce taxes. And so as a consequence, the demand for the national currency will be smaller than it would otherwise have been. Okay, and we can see that especially in developing economies where basically people don't use the national currency for their private transaction. They only use it to deal with the government. Okay. And so an important point of improving your monetary sovereignty is to try to deal with different aspects of enforcement. On the other side, okay, if you have a government that is very strongly sovereign and that have strong political power, okay, the demand for its currency may extend way beyond the domestic economy, okay? And so currently we have that with the US dollar, okay? If you go back in time, okay, you'll have many examples of coins that circulate far outside their area of issuance, okay, precisely because you have a sovereign that is pretty strong. Okay, so here we have basically two extreme. The first one where you don't have or you have weak enforcement mechanisms for the payments of taxes, then you have a very weak demand and very narrow demand for the national currency. On the other side, if you have a strong political power, then you have a strong demand for the national currency. So that's it for the definition of what monetary sovereignty is. What we want to look at now is, well, how do you actually implement monetary sovereignty? And basically the broad answer is that you have heavy routine coordination between the Treasury and the central bank to make sure that basically government spends and taxes in a smooth and provide credit in a smooth fashion so that it doesn't disrupt the rest of the economy. Okay, and so we're going to look at this heavy routine coordination between the two entities of government. So monetary policy is about setting a policy rate and ensuring that the actual interest rate stays on target. Fiscal policy is about legislating a budget and implementing it. And then you have also financial policy, which is about promoting stability of the financial system through regulation and by providing a safe asset that is at the foundation of the pricing mechanism for the rest of the financial market. So the central bank is involved routinely in fiscal policy. And it does so by ensuring that Treasury's auctions are successful. And so there are several ways the central bank does that, okay? The first one is, depending on the country and depending on time, you have direct monetary financing of the Treasury. That is, the central bank purchases treasuries of these purchases treasuries, okay, and does that on a routine basis. Today, the country where this occurs the most routinely is Canada. If you go back to the United States, it's occurring in the past relatively frequently until the early 80s, where we will remove the ability of the central bank to do that. It's involved too in refinancing the Treasury. Okay, so if you take the case of the United States, today you cannot, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, cannot purchase new treasuries at auction to increase its holding of treasuries. But it can buy treasuries at auction to replenish those that are maturing on its balance sheet. Okay, so if bond A is coming due today, okay, what you can do is buy a new bond B, okay, at auction to replace the expiring bond. Okay, and so that gives a safe and stable refinancing channel for the Treasury that can roll over the public debt. Okay, and the central bank is a major holder of US Treasuries, so it's a strong refinancing channel. You have the last one, which is indirect monetary financing, where the central bank now not being allowed to directly purchase treasuries to increase its holding. What it does instead is work through intermediaries. In the United States, they are the primary dealers. In England, they are called the gilt-edged market makers, who are basically in the auction buying treasuries, and the central bank is behind ensuring that they have enough funding to buy the treasuries at auction, basically, when the auction settles. And so the central bank ensures that this funding is available by buying old treasuries from primary dealers, or by providing them credit collateralized by treasuries. So that's the first one. So you can see that there is here already not a clear cut in terms of central bank being not involved in fiscal policy. It's actually routinely involved in it. And the goal is to ensure that the budget passed by Congress can be implemented. Treasury itself is also involved in monetary policy through public debt management and cash management. So in terms of public debt management, the idea here is that you don't manage the public debt merely for budgetary purposes, but you also try to manage it to fulfill macroeconomic goals. So the first one is interest rate targeting, okay, where we have quite a few instances of the US Treasury issuing securities at the request of the central bank to help the central bank maintain interest rate on target. The idea here being that we have periods of time where there is too much reserve in the banking system, and that tends to push down the policy rate. So in this case, in the United States, would be the federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate goes below target. And so we need to drain, the central bank needs to drain the reserve. The problem is that the central bank doesn't have enough treasuries on its balance sheet to drain the reserves, okay, to sell to banks. And so what it asks is, it asks the Treasury to issue new treasuries to be sold to banks, so that way the reserves are drained. So the most recent example of that were the supplementary financing bills, okay? And we have another instance during World War II. So that's the first thing. So we have here Treasury issuing securities, even though it doesn't need, okay, to do so for budgetary purposes, but just because the central bank asks them to help maintain interest rates on target. The second reason is the issuance of treasuries to maintain basically the liquidity of financial markets. So in this case here, what we observe is that the treasuries may issue additional securities even though they are running surpluses. Okay, and so we observe that especially in case where you have long periods of surpluses. Australia was the most recent example that I know of in the early 2000s, where they ran a fiscal surplus for almost a decade, but continued to issue treasuries because they were concerned that the liquidity of the market would decline as if they follow the traditional course of basically repaying the public debt as they run more surpluses. And so they continue to issue treasuries even though they were running surpluses. We see something similar again in the United States during World War II. Same idea. It's just after World War II. Actually. In terms of cash management, what the Treasury will do to help the central bank maintain the interest rate on target is move funds between its different accounts. Okay, so the central bank, the Treasury has private bank accounts, and it has an account at the central bank. And so moving funds between them will change the amount of reserves in the banking system. And so the most recent example, again, was the Treasury move all its funds out of the private bank accounts into its central bank account to try to drain as much reserves. Okay, the idea was that in 2008, if you remember, there was a large financial crisis in the United States, and some banks desperately needed access to central bank refinancing channels because the Fed fund market basically almost shut down. And at the same time, the central bank wanted to maintain an interest rate above zero. And so the central bank was injecting hundreds of billions of dollars of reserves, okay, in the banking system. And on the other side, the Treasury was draining them. And I think I'll show you a picture about that in a minute. Right there. So here's what's going on. So you have the US. So here we have the late 2007. Okay, what you start to have is large injections of reserves in the banking system, with the central bank trying to help banks that are in difficulties. And then in September 2008, when Lehman Brothers basically shuts down, there you have huge increase in the amount of injection of reserves from about $200 billion to $700 billion here. Okay. Prior to that period of time, this injection of reserve was offset by the central bank selling treasuries on its balance sheet. And so what you observe during this period of time is there is a very large and quick decline in the amount of outstanding treasuries in the central bank. By the end of that period here, the central bank has only about $250 billion of treasuries left, and a lot of them have already been pledged for lending to financial institutions. So it doesn't have much to play with. And here we have a huge injection of reserve in the system. Okay, but at the same time, the central bank still has an interest rate target of about 1%. And so if you inject that much reserves, the federal funds rate will fall very quickly unless you find a way to drain them. And so on one side, you have the central bank injecting reserve. On the other side, it asks treasuries to help to drain reserves. So what the government was giving in one hand, it was taking back on the other hand through the Treasury selling supplementary financing bills and moving funds into its account at the Federal Reserve. Note that was not enough. Okay, here we have about almost $700 billion of injection. Here we have $600 billion of ejection or removal. So we have about $100 billion there that is still a net injection. And we do see the Fed fund rate trading below target at that time, but doesn't fall to zero. Okay, so you can see here through what I have seen is that the idea that the central bank and the US, the central bank is not merely involved in monetary policy, and the Treasury is not merely involved in fiscal policy. The two entities talk to each other and work together to make sure that monetary policy works smoothly and the interest rate stays on target, and to ensure that fiscal policy works smoothly, namely that the budget that was passed by Congress is implemented in a smooth fashion, and the Treasury can get the fund it needs to implement the budget. So moving on to some general principles. And so in terms of general principles, there are quite a few here I want to go through. First one is that you don't have financial constraints on a monetary sovereign government as long as, well, as long as you have monetary sovereignty, okay? And as long as you spend on goods and services that are priced in your domestic currency. So government can afford to buy anything for sale denominated in the domestic unit of account. Okay, so here we have two quotes. Keynes first says the government, which has control over the banking and currency system, can always find the cash to pay for its purchase of home-produced goods. Okay, goods that are produced in the country and that are denominated in the unit of account of the country. And here, more recently, we have Alan Greenspan that said there is nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody. Okay. The second one is that monetarily sovereign government cannot be forced to default on debts denominated in its own unit of account for economic reasons. Okay. It can default, but the default is basically purely voluntary and self-imposed. And if you look at data about default on public debt denominated in the national currency, defaults are extremely rare. There are cases of default, but they're pretty rare. One case, if you look at studies by Moody's, is they look at, for example, Venezuela. And so there was a debt service due on the public debt, and they could not find the person who was supposed to write the check. And somehow it disappeared the time it was due. So as a consequence, they defaulted. Okay, but it was just, so this is counted as a default because they didn't pay exactly on time. Maybe the guy went to the bathroom and they could not find him. So they just had to find him, sign the check, and then that's it. Okay. So, and so they go through a few other cases. Most of them are odd cases. The United States, for example, also defaulted in 1979 because the word processing software broke down. And so they didn't pay on time. Okay. So you have odd cases like that. The government has control over the cost of the public debt. So it can choose to enforce that control more or less tightly by deciding to focus on either the short-term hand of the interest rate structure, or by trying to target all interest rates in the interest rate structure of the public debt. And so again, throughout time and throughout countries, you have experiments in all cases, okay, where some stay on the shorthand, and then you have, so basically the central bank sets the federal fund rate, and what we observe in that case is that the Treasury bill rate will be highly correlated with the federal fund rate. Basically, if you look at coefficient of correlation is basically 1, okay, 0.9998. And then long-term Treasury rates also are quite strongly correlated, okay, with a coefficient of correlation of 0.85, okay. And so you still have a tight indirect influence on the interest rate structure by just setting the Fed fund rate. But at times, the government has decided to target the entire yield curve, okay. And the public debt basically is managed to fulfill broader goals than just making sure the treasuries has enough money. Okay, and we saw that these macroeconomic goals are not necessarily consistent with budgetary logic. Okay, we saw that a U.S. Australian Treasury issuing treasuries when it was running surpluses. Okay, we have other cases where, for example, the United States will choose to issue securities that pay a higher interest rate and not issue others that pay lower interest rate because it wants to respond to the demands of financial institutions that says, well, we need more of that and less of that type of treasuries. Okay. So it again seems weird to want to try to pay more for what you are more interest on your securities. But if you understand that the public debt is not managed strictly on a budgetary logic, but to fulfill broader goals, okay, you start to understand why they do those things. So here we have again a quote from Foley and Juvenal, which are at the Federal Reserve Bank of was it Minneapolis? I'm not sure exactly. So as I say, as a sole manufacturer of dollars, whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. government can never become insolvent, i.e., unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets to remain operational. Okay. The other principle is that fiscal deficits are not an abnormal situation, and they are sustainable, or they can be sustainable if you have monetary sovereignty. So they are normal. Why? Because we have other sectors that usually want to be in surplus. And so the government needs to be in deficits. And so I'm pretty sure you have already seen that identity that the domestic private sector balance is DPB, so saving minus investment, is GB is the government balance, so taxes minus government spending, and the foreign balance is basically the current account balance of the foreign sector. Okay, and so we know that if you sum across these balances, it must be zero. Okay, another way to say that is for every debtor, there is a creditor. And so if the government is running a deficit and injecting currency or issuing treasuries, someone else in the rest of the economy has to be acquiring those things. So you have to account for both sides of these transactions. It's sustainable, okay, because monetary sovereignty basically gives you 1 degree of freedom in the tight accounting rule, okay? If these two want to be in surplus, okay, well, then the domestic private sector has to be in deficit, but that's fine, okay? It's sustainable because you have monetary sovereignty. Here, these two, domestic private balance and foreign balance, wants to be in surplus. This guy has to be in deficit, okay? So that's fine, okay? These two, the domestic private sector, okay, especially, can have a hard time maintaining a deficit for an extended period of time, okay? And so the government is usually the normal sector that runs deficits for extended period of time, and we can understand why if we understand what monetary sovereignty is all about. Next is that the stationary fiscal deficit is determined by the desires of other sectors. So if the other sectors want to have a total surplus that represents 5% of GDP, well, then the stationary fiscal deficit will be 5% of GDP. If that's not happening, then we're going to have adjustments. So for example, say that the desired surplus for other sector is 5%, but the fiscal deficit is 7%. Okay, that means it's too high compared to the desires of the other sectors. Okay, so what that means is that the other sectors are net saving more than what they desire. So what they're going to start doing is spend more. So you're going to have more consumption, more investment, and have more exports. Okay, that will increase national income. Okay, and as national income goes up, the automatic stabilizers will start to kick in. Means that taxes will rise and government spending will fall automatically without Congress doing anything. And so that will continue until the fiscal deficit reaches 5% of deficit, at which point the desired surplus equals the actual surplus in the other sectors. So they add no more spending. And so the level of national income stays the same. Okay, of course, we can work the other way around too. If the fiscal deficit is too small compared to the desired surplus of other sectors, then what you can start to have is these sectors are going to cut their spending, national income will fall, so taxes will fall, government spending will rise through automatic stabilizers, and the fiscal balance will become more in a deficit. And so what that means is that really the fiscal balance is not a proper policy goal. Okay, the automatic stabilizers will adjust the fiscal balance to the need of the economy. Okay, and so unless you have other sectors that are willing to deficit spend, then you'll have a self-defeating austerity. Okay, where the government decides. So again, we have a desired surplus of 5% by the domestic private sector and the foreign sector. And the government decides, nope, I want my fiscal balance to become a deficit of 1%. Okay. Well, if you start to implement this type of policies where you discretionarily cut spending, okay, so take the case of Greece during the Eurozone crisis, where they cut retirement payments, decrease welfare payments to, and so that of course has major socioeconomic consequences. Okay, then what you observe then is that you have a recession in the economy. People don't spend, just try to save as much as possible, and so with that, the automatic stabilizers kick in, mostly through tax. Actually, here where taxes will plunge, tax revenues, and so we're going to be back to a deficit of 5%, basically. Okay, and so we observe that in Greece. We observe that also in the UK, where they try to do the same thing. Those are two recent examples. Okay. So austerity policy can work, but it has to be on the conditions that other sectors are willing to deficit spend. If they are not, then you're going to run into trouble, basically. And most of the time you will, because these other sectors do not want deficit spend. There is no fiscal autonomy that is gained from trying to balance the budget. Okay. It does not give you any breathing room, putting money in the lockbox to try to save Social Security, does not increase the ability to pay for Social Security. Clinton in the United States was very happy that it reached surpluses, and so then the immediate question that came after that, what are we going to use the surpluses for? Now we have more money, so we have a bigger breathing room. Those things are really not relevant. Okay. Monetary sovereignty gives you the degree of freedom you need, gives you the breathing room that you need. Okay. So here is some example, some data, okay, where we go beyond the United States. And so let me explain what's going on in this graph. So it's basically a graphical implementation of the accounting balance identity. Okay, so on the vertical axis, we have the domestic private balance. Okay, which is positive if it's above zero, and negative it's below zero. The unit here is percentage of GDP. So it goes from 15% of GDP to negative 15% of GDP. On the horizontal axis, we have the foreign balance. Okay, where we look at it again from the point of view of the foreign sector. If it's positive, it means that the current account of the foreign sector is positive. You could look at it from the point of view of the domestic economy you're looking at, but then you just take the opposite of the foreign balance. Okay, so that means here that the foreign sector is in surplus. If you prefer, the domestic economy is in deficit relative to the foreign sector. And here we have a negative value, meaning that the foreign sector is in deficit. And then the diagonal here is, given that we know that this must hold, okay, the sum of all sectors must be zero. So that means that the government balance is the opposite of the sum of the other two sectors. Okay, so we have this diagonal that implicitly represents the government balance. And so if you are to the right of that line, then the government is in deficit. If you are to the left of that diagonal, the government is in surplus. So what you observe here, what I plotted, is many different countries over different periods of time. Okay, starting I think in the 1970s, you have less countries because there is less data available for other countries. But by the 90s, okay, you have much more countries available. The general point of the graph is to show you that most countries in the OECD deficits, most government of OECD countries deficit spend. Okay, so the normal case for those countries is to be in the gray areas. Yes, you have countries that are able to be in the on the left side. Okay, lots of them are Northern European countries that are oil-rich countries. Okay, so that have massive exports of these energy-related commodities, and so they are able to generate to have the foreign balance to be in deficits, or if you prevent, to generate a current account balance that is positive for their countries. Okay, but by far the general case is that most countries are on the other side of the balance. So the idea that fiscal deficits are something that are abnormal is really not observed. The stylized fact of macroeconomics should be that government deficit spend. Another stylized fact would be that the domestic private sector tend to be in surplus. Okay, so if you want a stylus fact you can take is that we usually operate in the upper quadrant here and to the right side of it. Okay, so this is the norm here. And so an important point of macroeconomics and to becomes to explain the stylized fact. Okay, why is it the case that usually government deficit spend and usually the domestic private sector is in surplus? Okay, and so what I tried to do in the past few minutes is try to explain to you that why this is the case. So here is an example of, again, for the United States, you don't have to just look at the United States. There are quite a few studies, for example, by Tymoigne or Cram that look at many other countries, okay, and basically reach the same conclusion, okay. And the conclusion here that you get from the data is that, well, the fiscal balance or the fiscal position doesn't have much of an impact on interest rates, whereas monetary policy has. Okay, so if you look a bit at the data here, what we have here is a nominal interest rates right here. Okay, and here we have the fiscal position of the US federal government. It's a percentage of gross national product. Why not gross domestic product? Because for the data I'm looking at from Q1 1900 to Q4 2016, GDP data are not available until 1929. And at that time, they're only available really on a quarterly basis from 1945, about five-ish. So if you want, it's like 1947, I think. But if you want quarterly data, you have to use GNP. What you observe, so if the idea that fiscal deficits tend to raise interest rate would mean that you would have a dot plot, okay, a cloud of points that would mostly look like this, okay, 45-degree line but reverse. Okay, so something around that trend line. What we observe instead is that there's basically no relationship between the fiscal position and interest rates. I actually updated this graph. I should have put the most recent one because the current period in the United States is quite interesting to where we are running very large deficits and interest rates are again low. So you have extra points in the most recent data around here, okay? And so here we have very large, so this is World War II in the United States, okay? And very low interest rates. And for other more normal periods of time, there's basically no relation here, okay? On the other side here, what we have is again, nominal interest rates and federal fund rate. And you can see that for average short-term rate, the coefficient of correlation is almost 1. And for average long-term rate is also very high, okay? So what drives interest rate is really the monetary policy, okay, not fiscal policy. So once you understand that financing is not the issue, that you have control over the cost of the public debt, and that monetary sovereignty gives you a degree of freedom in terms of implementing the policies you want, the question becomes, well, what kind of policies do you want? Okay. What should you spend on? How should you set your tax structure? Okay. And so those are important questions. Okay. And they are political questions. So the fact that you have monetary sovereignty doesn't mean that you can spend an unlimited amount of money, okay? Because you have constraints that exist on you that are non-financial. And the two main non-financial constraints are political constraints and resource constraints, okay? And so you have to decide as a society what you want the governments to do, how you want it to do it, and you have to figure out if you have the resources available to fulfill the public purpose that you set for yourself. And so MMT basically sees many socioeconomic challenges where government could help. Okay, one that is pretty well known is unemployment. Unfair inequalities, another one. We have an aging society. We have climate change, pollution, among many other issues on which the government could help. And so the important point is that none of these issues are solved by putting money in a lockbox or trying to reach a surplus. Okay, you gain nothing from doing that. Okay. And while you do this, you have to understand that, yes, you have enough money to pay. Okay, you can create the money by keystroking amounts, but you have to account for the potential of inflationary risks, of waste, and potential decrease in incentive to work. And so you want to make sure that, first of all, you have a budget. Okay, so the fact that you have monetary sovereignty doesn't make budgeting irrelevant. Okay, you need a budget to maintain transparency and accountability of policymakers to make sure that things run on track. And you have to have broad participations in debates regarding what the government should be doing. So here is something that tries to summarize that in a box. Okay, there's not we are not made to read 3D boxes, so I didn't put the political constraints. So here's 2D box where you have financial and real constraints. And you have two questions to ask. The first one is, can the government run out of money? Yes and no. And our resource suppliers, so labor, raw material, any other goods and services you can think of, are they willing to sell governments to the governments at price denominated in the unit of account? So again, you have yes or no. So if there are not, if you say no to both, okay, so see if they are willing to sell goods and services to the government and the government cannot run out of money, then you have no financial or real constraint. You still have political constraint, okay, but you don't have financial and real constraint. The opposite case is if the resource suppliers refuse to sell goods and services to the government, and the government can run out of money, then you have both financial and real constraints that come in. Okay. And so one of the point of MMT is to say that making a difference and understanding these different constraints is important, because depending on where you look in terms of countries, some of these constraints apply more than others. Another point to understand is that I spent quite a bit of time looking at the United States, even though I looked also abroad here, but that all this does not apply only to the United States. Okay, there are quite a few extensive studies done for other countries, okay, that show similar things that I showed you here. The US is just a special case in the sense that the foreign sector desires to have a surplus and so wants to accumulate US dollar assets. And so what that means is that the fiscal deficit has to be larger than it would otherwise have been. Okay. Other countries, there is no foreign desire to hold the domestic currency, and so your fiscal deficit will be smaller. Okay, and usually we'll respond to the desire of the domestic population to hold the currency. Okay, and again, if you have a case where you have a country where you have issues on forcing tax dues, and there may not even be a desire to accumulate the domestic currency in the nation. And in that case, the stationary state fiscal balance is a balanced budget, or maybe even a surplus. So some economies have limited domestic resources, they have limited ability to impose and enforce taxes, and the foreign demand for the domestic currency is zero. Okay, well, in that case, the size of the stationary fiscal deficit is small, and any deficit beyond that will tend to be inflationary. So to conclude, and I'm 1 hour, okay, so if you have a monetary sovereignty, okay, you still need to have a legislative branch that passes a budget. Okay, it's not whatever you do, carte blanche in terms of spending. Okay, you need to still determine what your economic priorities are. You need to make sure that the process through which the spending is done is transparent and there is accountability in the process to avoid fraud and waste. You still have to have an executive branch that needs tax. So for the Treasury, you need to fulfill budgetary needs, but you also have microeconomic and macroeconomic goals that are important also to account for when you set a tax policy. So for example, if you decide that the public purpose says that we should try to lower income and wealth inequality, well, one tool you can use to do that is to use the tax structure. But if you look at it from the lens of modern money theory, what that means is that you're not going to look at taxes for the purpose of reducing inequality, and on the other side, look at, well, how much tax revenue will that bring? Okay, and how will we use that money to fund other things? No, you just keep your eyes on the goal. The goal is to reduce inequality. And so what we're looking at is not revenue generating tax policy. We're looking at a confiscatory policy in that case. So that means that if you set tax rates, you have to set them high enough so that you reduce inequality. Okay, and that means usually raising them quite a bit. So if you look at discussions today in the United States surrounding this issue, policymaker becomes satisfied with increasing tax rate by very small amounts, 1 or 2 percentage points, and they say that's good enough because with that we have enough money to fund other things. Well, the question is, have you been able to reduce inequality by such a small tax rate? Probably not. Okay, you would need much higher tax rates, 50%, 70% tax rate. That would probably do it. So you want confiscation. You don't want to look at it from tax revenue generation. Okay. And as long as, and we know that wealthy individuals are good at evading taxes, okay, but as long as you change their behavior by making them park their wealth in a way that makes it harder for them to use it for political influence, well, that makes them basically give more donations so that it improves equality of wealth and income, you have accomplished what you wanted to do. The executive branch also still need to issue bonds to fulfill budgetary and financial stability goals. Monetary sovereignty implies that, well, bond vigilantes and credit rating and fiscal deficit are very limited to no impact on the cost of the public debt. Okay, so One example, again, regarding credit ratings is 2011, Standard & Poor's downgraded the US public debt, but at the same time, interest rate fell. Okay, so that's quite strange. Okay, so again, there is no connection here between that rating, which is really unnecessary, and interest rates. The government has the flexibility to spend on goods and services that are available at least in its country. Okay, if you have broader demand for your currency, then you can spend on goods and services that are available outside of your country too. And you can use the public debt to fulfill broader macroeconomic goals that are not necessarily consistent with budgetary goals. And so public finance should not be analyzed in the same way we look at household finance or business finance. They're not the same animal. Monetary sovereignty does not imply that the government can spend a limitless amount of money. It does not mean that you need to have direct monetary financing of the Treasury. You don't have to change anything. So we can hear a lot of arguments that implementing my MMT would be a world-changing event. Well, no, you don't need to change anything. Okay, you can, if you want, include direct monetary financing, but you don't have to. The way things work today work fine. Okay, and so we already have a heavy coordination between the central bank and the Treasury to ensure smooth fiscal and monetary operations. So we don't have to change anything. All right, I'll stop here and open for questions.
Thank you for your lecture. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's pretty weak, but I'll try to work with that.
Let's try for now.
Now it's better?
Uh-oh. What happened? Let's see. Yeah, it's a bit better. Yes.
Okay, so we'll start the Q&A session. Okay, there's the first question. Thank you, brother.
What can MMT can say about the content of the fiscal deficits? Because in a post-Keynesian framework, we can easily say that not all fiscal deficits are equal. For example, financing with the public debt some tax cuts for the rich or some tax cuts for companies are not equal to financing some public orders or some public procurements or some expenditures to workers with a high propensity to consume. So what MMT can say about the content of the fiscal deficits?
Okay, so you're gonna have to repeat the questions because it's can someone come closer and tell me what he asked, because I really could not hear.
Maybe just use the computer microphone?
Yeah, I think you're gonna have to come to the computer and ask your questions very close. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for me to hear.
So, Mike, you hear me?
Ah,
Yes.
better.
So,
oh, yeah, much better.
So my question is what MMT can say about the content of the fiscal deficits, because in a post-Keynesian framework, all fiscal deficits are not equal. Because, for example, financing with the public debt, some tax cuts for the rich or tax cuts for companies are not equal to financing public orders for companies like construction, like some construction for buildings, or some expenditures for workers who have a high propensity to consume. So fiscal deficits are not the same. What MMT can say, because with MMT, we just talk about the quantity of the fiscal deficit, but not the quality of the content of the fiscal deficits. Thank you.
Cool. Good. Yeah. So I was trying to work that into the topic toward the end there, when I looked at the tax structure and the type of spending you want to do. So yes, the really important questions, as I said, is what do you want the government to do? How do you set the tax structure? And what do you do? What do you want the tax structure to accomplish for you? So those are indeed extremely important questions to ask. But you don't ask them by thinking, oh, will that generate a deficit? Okay, you ask these questions to try to answer precisely the question you wanted to ask. And here indeed is, what do you want those things to do? Okay, so do you want to have a tax structure that help encourage labor, or do you want, or do you have a tax structure today that discourages labor? Okay, do you want to have a tax structure that promotes whatever you define as good and reduce whatever you define as society as bad? Okay, so you have to define what goods and bads are and set your tax structure in that way. So those are indeed critical questions to ask. And so MMT has delved into those issues, okay, by looking at issues of inequality, looking at issues of promoting labor, for example, social security. What we have said is that the payroll tax, for example, should be eliminated because it's discouraging labor, it's regressive, and it discourages employment. So by making labor more expensive. So you don't want that tax. Okay. So yes, and the same thing, of course, on the spending side, the quality of their spending is extremely important, because it's well known, for example, that military spending tends to be inflationary spending. Okay, and again, there you have to ask yourself what type of involvement you want the government to be in, and what kind of problems you have, what you see as problems. And for sure, in the United States and throughout the world, one of the major issues is climate change. Okay, and so again, we have recently have some MMT people working on a Green New Deal and trying to figure out the cost of the Green New Deal and trying to move the debate away from the idea that it's unaffordable, okay, because we're going to spend trillions of dollars, okay, and moving away from the dollar amount more toward how much of the resources do you need in your economy to implement a Green New Deal. It turns out it's quite small, okay, it looks like $1 trillion, okay, over 10 years every year, and that's what, 5% of your account, 5%. And if you net out all the decline in other costs, you reach a net cost that is really small, about less than 1% of your economy. So we try to move the balance of the debate away from focusing on dollar amount and the fiscal impact toward, the type of spending you need, and do you have the resources to implement those spending?
I think the mic is working.
Can you hear me okay?
It's better, yeah. And then we might want to do that close, yeah.
Now you can hear me.
Yes,
Yes?
very good.
Cool. So you made the comment that you think the relationship and the coordination between the Treasury and the Fed is sufficient and this doesn't need to change. And I'd like to ask about this a bit, and maybe I'll talk about kind of central bank Treasury coordination a bit more generally. But one of the things that happens now with the way this relationship stands is that you have central banks saying they don't want to take on social or environmental aims and commitments of governments because this is outside their mandate for price stability, or in the case of the Fed, also employment, right? And so instead there's this ethos of following the idea of market neutrality. So there's a disconnect that I think is relevant. And then also maybe relatedly is this sort of shift in the monetary financing regime post-Great Financial Crisis, where monetary financing is done not to support specific government aims, but rather to, this kind of market maker of last resort to backstop the financial system more broadly by stabilizing the value of collateral. So yeah, I wonder what you think about this.
Yeah. So for this, I think I always go back to Minsky. Okay, and what he said is that basically the central bank has an important role in trying to influence the way banks make business. And what that means is the type of assets they accept on their balance sheet. And the main way the central bank can do that is by accepting or refusing some financial instrument as collateral for its lending channels. And so, yes, I think that there is a role for government, for the central bank to try to influence how banks make business. But again, it's going to be a discussion about what the public purpose is. The central bank is dependent on Congress, okay, and so Congress can do what it wants. And so again, it's going to be public pressure to do that. This idea that the central bank is completely independent from the political process is an illusion. Okay, it strongly depends on that. And so, yes, I think you have some role for the central bank to try to help with climate change by moving financial institutions away from fossil fuel financing and toward green energy, for example, financing.
Okay, is it okay, or can you hear me?
Closer, please.
Hello?
Oh, yeah.
It's working.
Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay, let's try then. Thing is, there's a lot of echo if you move further.
Okay, is there any more questions? Hello, Eric?
Yep.
Okay. So is there any more questions to Eric?
Okay, let's try.
The
Oh, you.
ceiling that the US has, so every other year, every 4 years, that the government stops paying or threatens to stop paying workers unless they increase the debt ceiling. You look irritated.
Yeah. So the last time was in 2011. Yeah, the Republican basically. Yes, sure. Yeah. What about it?
Wasn't there a time during Trump where it was even longer? So there must have been more.
Yeah, so it comes back in the United States, we have this silly game where the budgetary process has a two-stage process where Congress first pass a budget, and the budget is usually in deficit, okay? And at the second one is you have a time to also raise the debt ceiling. What that means is that, well, given that you have passed a deficit, you're going to have to issue more treasuries. And so over the years, the outstanding amount of treasuries, the public debt rises, okay? And Congress has put a ceiling on the amount of treasuries that can be outstanding in the economy, okay? usually in the past, what the Congress would do is just, given that they have passed the deficit, okay, at some point they will reach the ceiling, okay, as a matter of logic. And so what they did is just, well, let's raise the ceiling, okay, and then you do something like that, okay. Today, this ceiling has become something used as a political tool, where once you reach the ceiling, okay, the Republican refuse to vote to raise the ceiling, even though they approve a budget deficit. So that means that they have to approve the fact that the public debt will go up. And so you have indeed those ceiling games, and that's where you have an unproductive use of political power. And definitely MMT would remove that. This is really focusing exactly on the wrong things of the political process. Yes.
Strengthens the narrative that the government can indeed run out of money, because the entire country sees how all national service comes to a halt, which just proves the narrative that the government doesn't have enough money. So that's quite contrary to the money to the monetary purpose.
Yeah. So they have tied their own feet, and then they complain they can't run. Well, the answer is that you have to untie your feet. Okay, so yes, it's a self-imposed constraint. It's a silly constraint, and it can be dangerous indeed. Yes. But again, it's a purely voluntary aspect. It's not something forced on government. They chose to do that.
Hello. Since we use...
Hello.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about a matter of phrasing an argumentation, I had a question regarding the first part of your presentation, so the classification of sovereignty. You've mentioned that the US is a special case due to the high demand for US currency. Would it make sense in regard to like classification, because like people from not from the US use the argument that the US can implement, so to speak, MMT because they are a special case, etc., etc. Would it make sense to reclassify, so to speak, the US and to a lesser extent Japan and the UK as super sovereign nations, and then speak about countries that have hard currency but are not in this as much of a privileged position as the US, so like, for example, Canada, Sweden.
Yeah. So I would say that they have a broader fiscal space, and so they have more leeways to implement to use their monetary sovereignty. That's how I would put it, because the demand for their currency is much broader. That's all.
Okay, is there any other questions?
Hello? Oh yeah, it works. Thanks for a good lecture. I have a question on the kind of the implementation of this. So recognizing that there are real constraints, how will we go about, watching different sectors and how much can we spend in this sector versus that? If you would elaborate a little bit on that. Thanks.
Sure. So, here you have several ways to go about it. So the first one of the way you can try to deal with that is to have some form of decentralized planning. Okay, and one of the tools that modern money theory put forward for that is a job guarantee program, where you have federally funded or nationally funded okay, if it's not a federation, job guarantee, but the impetus for the project comes from local authorities, from nonprofit organizations that know what the needs of their communities are, know that if they have the resources or not to implement. And we have, going back to, for example, the New Deal, something like that, where the local communities would propose a project, put down a budget, and then it will be basically looked over by qualified engineers or other people that are qualified to judge the project, and given a go or a no-go depending on the feasibility of the project. So that's how you want to do it. So the idea that planning can be done is really not, I think, correct. All economic units plan. Okay, corporations plan, people plan, government can plan too. It's just a matter of doing it in a way that is as democratic and as flexible as possible to ensure that you use the resources in a way that is, or you implement spending in a way that is consistent with the resources you have. And so for that, you need quite a bit of feedback from the bottom. Okay, you cannot centralize everything. That won't work.
So I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the speech. I have a question. Maybe it's a bit it's related, but not a core point of MMT. What you said about the function of taxes is that they are somehow confiscatory and they should fulfill a redistributive function. But how does it how can it be applied in a context where we have free movement of capital? So is MMT suggesting that, or does capital control form part of the core ideas of MMT? Because it, of course, increases monetary sovereignty. Or how can we combine these two things if we want some kind of movement of capital? Thank you.
Yeah. So so here we go to international issues, and for international movements of capital, okay, I think there the best way to go is you need to have international agreements among countries. Okay, that's the best way to go, because otherwise you have always ways to evade those things. You have paradise where you can go and evade all taxations. So that's a much more complicated thing to achieve. You can do something for your own country, but you won't achieve much by yourself. Basically, you need to have international agreements, broad international agreements, to achieve something that help to do that. On the issue of capital control itself, yes, if you're gonna have to look case by case, but some countries may benefit from indeed having capital control to maintain some of their, to be able to use their sovereignty in a way that is useful to fulfill domestic goals, basically. Yes. Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, let's maybe wait 2 more minutes and. Okay, but we'll close the Q&A session. Sorry, Eric. Once again, thank you for a very interesting lecture. Thank you for your time, because I know that in Portland it's 6 o'clock in the morning.
It's 8. It's 8 now. It's 8. It's fine.
We are very grateful for your very interesting lecture, and thank you once again. And I hope that next year we will have an opportunity to host you at the summer school in Poznan in person.
That'd be nice. Yeah. Bye-bye.